imagine for a moment a fire, but, not a forest fire, not this flash flood of flames that just visibly sweeps across a landscape and demands, like, immediate panicked attention.
Right, yeah, something completely different.
Exactly. Think instead of an underground coal mine fire, it's this slow, smoldering burn creeping silently right beneath the surface of the earth.
And it thrives in those very specific, neglected conditions, right? In the dark, in poorly ventilated spaces.
Yeah, where the fuel is just densely packed and left totally undisturbed. I mean, for years, you might not even know it's there. The ground up above looks perfectly normal.
Until it doesn't.
Right, because when the Earth shifts or a sudden draft of oxygen is introduced into those tunnels, that latent fire just violently erupts to the surface. It becomes an absolute catastrophe.
And you definitely can't just toss a quick bucket of water on a coal seam fire.
No, absolutely not. It requires relentless, continuous surveillance. You have to do long-term structural engineering, fundamentally altering the airflow. You have to address the actual environment that allowed the fire to take hold in the first place.
That visual perfectly captures the reality of the pathogen we're looking at today. I mean, it's the absolute definition of a smoldering structural epidemic.
It really is.
We're dealing with an organism that has basically mastered the art of the slow burn, just hiding within the host, waiting for the structural integrity of the immune system or, frankly, the society to crack.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are undertaking a very specific mission. So if you are a medical student, a junior doctor, a public health trainee, or, a practicing clinician, this conversation is designed specifically as a conceptual companion for you.
Yeah, we're using the structural frameworks from the Oxford textbook of Global Public Health, specifically chapter 8.14 on tuberculosis.
Right, and we're going to use those insights to really pull apart why this disease is just so endlessly resilient. We aren't just going to list statistics or regurgitate a textbook at you.
Nobody wants that.
Exactly. We want to clarify the frameworks, strengthen your clinical reasoning, and help you understand the why and the how behind the global response.
Because the goal here is pattern recognition. I mean, knowledge in clinical practice and public health is most valuable when you actually understand the interlocking systems.
Yeah, you have to see the big picture.
Right. We need to move way beyond memorizing drug regimens or diagnostic criteria. We have to focus on the underlying logic of the pathogen's survival and our systemic response to it.
Because when you understand the mechanism, the memorization kind of just takes care of itself.
Exactly.
So let's jump right into the sheer scale of this, because the historical context makes the current reality really difficult to process. I mean, we discovered the bacillus over a century ago.
Yeah, in 1882.
Right. And we have vaccines, we have antibiotics that were developed way back in the mid-20th century. Yet TB remains the captain of all these men of death, to borrow that famous 17th century phrase.
It's a heavy title, but it's accurate.
It is. When we look at the data and the text notes that in a single year, we are looking at 8.7 million active incident cases and 1.4 million deaths, it just forces a massive question. Why has an ancient, slow-growing pathogen outlasted our modern, highly advanced medical arsenal?
Well, to answer that, you have to look at the shape of the epidemic compared to other major global killers. Take HIV or malaria, for example.
Right.
If you map their epidemic curves over the last decade or two, you see genuine, absolute declines in incident cases, like drops of roughly 15 to 25%.
Wow, so we are visibly bending those curves downward.
Yeah, we are. But with tuberculosis, the decline in the incidence rate has, for a really long time, essentially just mirrored the rate of global population growth.
Wait, so the percentage dropped slightly, but because the sheer size of the human population is growing?
Exactly. The absolute number of people suffering, the total burden of TB morbidity, remains staggeringly high. It's potentially higher in sheer numbers than at many points in human history.
It's just because there are more humans living in the conditions that TB exploits? That is wild.
It is. And this requires us to firmly establish a vital conceptual framework right out of the gate, which is the difference between incidence and prevalence.
Right, because in casual medical conversation, those terms kind of blur together.
They do, but separating them is basically the bedrock of TB epidemiology. So incidence represents the new cases, that 8.7 million newly active cases per year we just mentioned.
So if we use the classic bathtub analogy, incidence is the water actually flowing from the faucet into the tub.
Perfect analogy, yes. Prevalence, however, is the total reservoir of disease. It's the water already sitting in the bathtub.
Okay.
And with TB, that prevalence is heavily weighted by a massive unseen pool of asymptomatic latent infections. That is your underground coal fire. You cannot look at the incidence rate and think you understand the size of the epidemic.
And geographically, that bathtub isn't filling up evenly around the world either. The disparities are just jarring. Over 80% of TB cases are concentrated in just 22 high-burden countries.
Yeah, India and China alone carry about 38% of the entire global burden.
It's staggering. When you look at incidence rates, in the African region, you're looking at around 262 cases per 100,000 people every single year. But in the Americas,
It's much lower.
yeah, it's just 28 per 100,000.
Which tells us immediately that the pathogen is highly opportunistic. It exploits specific environmental and socioeconomic vulnerabilities.
So it's not just random.
Not at all. The rates are highest in young adults, historically higher in men, and universally higher among the poorest strata of society. We are looking at an intersection of crowded informal settlements, under-resourced prison systems, malnutrition, and crucially, high HIV prevalence.
Those are the actual engines of transmission. But I want to challenge the biomedical focus here for a second.
Let's go for it.
If we have highly effective antibiotic regimens, why is it that wealthy nations essentially neutralize the threat of TB before those modern drugs even existed, while the global south is still caught in this cycle? I mean, a bacterium doesn't have a passport, right?
Right.
It doesn't recognize a macroeconomic border. It just wants a host.
It doesn't care about borders, but it cares deeply about the built environment. And this is where historical epidemiology is so illuminating.
How so?
Well, if you look at the United States from the 1950s up through the early 1980s, the incidence of TB was falling by about 8% every single year.
That's a massive sustained decline.
It is. And a huge portion of that progress was driven not by medical miracles, but by the social determinants of health.
So things outside the clinic.
Exactly. It was driven by improved housing codes, better indoor ventilation, decreased overcrowding, and better baseline population nutrition.
Ah.
This massive decline was happening long before the widespread, systematic implementation of the modern DOTS strategy, the directly observed therapy strategy.
So we essentially performed upstream structural engineering. We made the physical environment inherently hostile to the aerodynamic spread of a droplet nucleus.
Yes.
We basically starved the fire of its fuel by separating the people and giving them fresh air.
We did. But, the corollary to that is terrifying. What happens when a society abandons that structural infrastructure?
Right, because you can't just fix it once and forget it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the early 1980s, in the U.S., there was a political shift, and large reductions in funding for public health and TB control programs were imposed. The surveillance networks were dismantled.
And you combine that sudden lack of vigilance with a rise in urban homelessness, increased incarceration rates in overcrowded facilities, and the dawn of the HIV epidemic.
And the pathogen just exploded.
Yeah.
From 1985 to 1992, the U.S. saw a massive resurgence, including a terrifying spike in multi-drug-resistant TB. It proved definitively that Mycobacterium tuberculosis is an opportunistic exploiter of failing social infrastructure. It required a massive infusion of emergency funding and a total rebuild of the public health apparatus to contain it again.
It's exactly the shifting ground in our coal mine. You let the public health infrastructure crack, the vulnerability opens up, and the latent fire erupts into a clinical catastrophe.
Exactly.
But we should note, it's not exclusively a story of failure, right? When rigorous frameworks are applied, the math actually works. Peru, for instance, saw a 6% annual decline in incidence throughout the 1990s by implementing intensive case detection and high cure rates.
Yeah, and China halved its TB prevalence over 2 decades.
Right, so the tools we have can work.
They can, but those successes are incredibly fragile. I mean, while China halved its prevalence, today, a massive proportion of their new cases are resistant to at least one cornerstone drug.
Oh.
And in Africa, the absolute number of cases basically doubled between 1990 and 2005 due to the HIV syndemic. So to understand why these tools fail so often, we really need to zoom in. We need to look at the biological journey of the bacillus itself and how it interacts with the human immune system.
Let's do that. Let's trace that transmission mechanism. We're talking about Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It's a remarkably slow-growing bacillus compared to something like strep or staph, right?
Very slow, yeah.
And humans are its principal reservoir. There is no environmental reservoir like cholera has in water. It spreads purely through the air.
Right. An individual with active, untreated pulmonary TB coughs, sneezes, or even just speaks loudly, and they expel these microscopic droplet nuclei containing the bacilli.
And if you are sharing that poorly ventilated airspace, you just inhale them deep into your alveoli.
But here's a crucial point for clinical reasoning, and this is super important. Exposure does not automatically equal infection.
Really? Because
Yeah.
you'd think if you breathe it in, you're infected.
You would think so. But studies of household contacts people living under the exact same roof as a highly infectious, smear-positive patient show that the majority of those contacts actually escape infection entirely.
Wow, the majority.
Yeah, only about 1/3 acquire what we measure as an infection. The likelihood of the bacteria successfully establishing an infection depends heavily on the concentration of the bacteria expelled by the index case, the proximity of the contact, and the total duration of time spent sharing that air.
Okay, so it's a numbers game and a time game. But if the bacteria does establish a foothold, this is where the textbook forces a complete paradigm shift, doesn't it? Because for a long time, the clinical teaching around latency was very binary. It was almost like a light switch.
It was entirely binary.
Well,
The old dogma stated that you either had latent TB, meaning the bacteria were completely dormant, walled off in a calcified granuloma, metabolically inactive.
you were a dead-end host, safe and non-infectious.
Right. Or the switch flipped and you had active TB, meaning the bacteria were multiplying, carving out cavities in your lungs, and you were symptomatic and highly contagious.
Clean categories. You're either a patient or you weren't.
Exactly. But human biology rarely respects clean categories. The new paradigm recognizes that latency is not a state of true dormancy. It is a highly dynamic immunological spectrum.
Meaning the immune system isn't just resting.
Far from it. Your innate and adaptive immune systems, specifically your macrophages and T cells, are locked in a continuous active cold war with the bacilli. The body builds these cellular prisons called granulomas to contain the bacteria.
But the bacteria aren't dead in there.
No. In many individuals categorized as having latent infection, some of those bacilli remain viable. They are metabolically active. They are constantly testing the perimeter of that granuloma. It's an active state of containment that requires constant energy and surveillance from the host's immune system.
And the data supporting this spectrum is actually quite unsettling. When epidemiologists conduct population-based prevalence surveys in high-burden areas, meaning they literally go out and culture the sputum of thousands of random people, they find that a significant majority of culture-confirmed TB cases are completely asymptomatic.
Yeah. Think about that for a second.
It's crazy. We grow the live Mycobacterium from their lungs in a lab, proving they have active replicating bacteria, but the patient reports feeling absolutely fine. No cough, no fever, no night sweats.
Which means the rigid wall between latent and active is a complete illusion. You can have metabolically active, potentially transmissible bacteria and feel perfectly healthy.
Which turns the entire concept of public health control on its head. If you are only looking for people who are coughing, you are missing a massive portion of the actively infected reservoir.
Exactly. And if we look at the timeline of progression, it emphasizes this dynamic state even more.
What does the timeline look like?
Well, if an immunocompetent adult acquires a new infection, their highest risk of progressing to symptomatic clinical disease is concentrated in the first year, roughly a 3 to 10% chance.
Okay.
But if their immune system successfully establishes that granulomatous cold war, the risk drops dramatically to about 0.05% per year. It remains a lifelong, persistent risk of reactivation, but the baseline probability is very low.
The baseline probability is low, assuming the immune system remains a robust, well-funded military. But if you introduce an accelerant that defunds that military, the granuloma collapses.
That's exactly what happens. We will explore those accelerants shortly. But there is one more vital concept regarding transmission dynamics, particularly in high-burden areas.
That's like reality of reinfection.
Yes. In many infectious diseases, once you survive the primary infection, your adaptive immune system provides durable, sterilizing immunity. You don't get it again.
Right, like measles.
Exactly. But with TB, having a latent infection might provide some partial immunity against a new exposure. Perhaps an 80% lower likelihood of developing active disease compared to a completely naive host. But that protection is incredibly easily overwhelmed.
Because in a hyperendemic environment, the exposure isn't a one-time event.
Right. If you cure a patient of active TB, or if they have a stable latent infection, but you send them right back to work in a crowded, poorly ventilated gold mine, or back to an overcrowded informal settlement,
They are going to inhale a new, massive inoculum of bacteria.
Yes, and the sheer volume of that new exposure just overwhelms whatever partial immunity they had. Reinfection is a massive, underappreciated driver of the epidemic in the Global South.
Yeah.
You cannot just treat the biological host. You have to treat the air they're breathing.
Which brings us to a part of the clinical picture that perfectly illustrates this dynamic of local transmission. Pediatric TB. Children under 15 make up a relatively small percentage of officially notified cases globally, but community-level surveillance tells a completely different story.
It really does. In high-burden regions, children likely account for 10 to 20% of all true incident cases.
So why the gap? Why the difference between official notifications and the reality on the ground?
Because pediatric TB is incredibly difficult to diagnose.
Yeah.
The cornerstone diagnostic tool in much of the world is still sputum smear microscopy, having the patient cough deeply into a cup and looking at the phlegm under a microscope.
But young children can't really do that, can they?
No, they lack the respiratory mechanics to generate a forceful, productive cough. They just swallow their sputum. Consequently, the sensitivity of a sputum smear in a young child is often less than 10%.
Furthermore, their disease pathology is different. They frequently develop extrapulmonary disease or intrathoracic lymph node disease, where the bacteria are trapped in the lymphatics rather than sitting openly in the airway.
Precisely. To actually get a microbiological sample from an infant, clinicians often have to perform gastric lavage.
Oh.
Yeah, they pass a tube down the infant's nose into the stomach first thing in the morning to aspirate the swallowed sputum from the night before.
That sounds awful.
It's invasive, it's logistically challenging in a rural clinic, and it's highly distressing. Because of these diagnostic hurdles, children are often treated empirically based on symptoms and exposure history, or tragically, they remain undiagnosed until it's too late.
But the way public health utilizes pediatric cases is fascinating. It's a classic example of applying a framework to clinical data. Because young children under 5 cannot generate that forceful cough, and because their bacillary load is generally lower, they are rarely infectious to others.
Right. A sick toddler is almost never the vector spreading TB through a community.
They are not the vector. They are the sentinel.
This is a vital epidemiological framework. If you diagnose an infant with active TB, you know two things with absolute certainty.
Okay, what are they?
First, because they're an infant, their infection is recent. Second, because their mobility is limited primarily to their caregivers, they were infected by an adult in their immediate environment.
So the sick child is basically an early warning radar blip, indicating that an adult in their household has highly infectious, active pulmonary TB and is actively shedding the bacteria into the shared air.
Exactly. So the clinical intervention for the child immediately triggers a public health intervention for the household. You use the child as the beacon to find the source case, treat the adult, and sever the chain of transmission. We are focused on stopping transmission to the children, not from them.
And the urgency there cannot be overstated. While adults might maintain latency for decades, an infant's immature immune system is highly vulnerable.
Very vulnerable. In immunocompetent infants, the risk of progressing from a primary infection to lethal disseminated forms of the disease can be up to 10%.
Disseminated forms like miliary TB, where the bacteria seed throughout the organs like little millet seeds, or TB meningitis, which attacks the brain.
Yes. So the sentinel is not just a warning system. It is a highly vulnerable patient requiring immediate prophylaxis or treatment.
Well, you mentioned the vulnerability of the infant immune system. This feels like the perfect moment to shift our framework from the hazard of exposure to the actual determinants of clinical risk.
This distinction is basically the core of public health reasoning. The bacillus, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, is the hazard. It is the biological agent with the potential to cause harm.
Right.
But the risk, the actual probability that inhaling this hazard will result in active destructive disease, is heavily modulated by the host's biological vulnerabilities and their social environment.
And when we talk about biological vulnerability, the most catastrophic accelerant we have ever seen, the gasoline poured directly onto that smoldering underground fire, is HIV.
Without a doubt, HIV fundamentally dismantles the specific immune architecture required to contain TB. We discussed the granuloma earlier, that cellular prison built by macrophages and T cells.
Right, a Cold War containment.
Exactly. Well, HIV specifically targets and destroys CD4-positive T cells. Without those CD4 cells coordinating the response, the macrophage loses its ability to contain the bacteria. The granuloma literally dissolves.
That's terrifying.
If you are an adult with latent TB and you acquire HIV, your risk of developing active disease doesn't just increase slightly, it skyrockets. In high-incidence areas, HIV co-infection increases the risk of active TB by a factor of 14.
14 times.
And in lower incidence areas where baseline transmission is lower, the relative risk increases by a factor of up to 60.
It also completely rewrites the clinical timeline and presentation, right? The disease progression accelerates terrifyingly. If an HIV-positive individual with a severely depleted immune system is newly exposed to TB, up to 40% will develop clinical illness within 3 months.
Yeah, it bypasses latency almost entirely.
And when it presents, it doesn't look like classic upper lobe cavitary lung disease. It presents as disseminated extrapulmonary disease. It's often smear negative because there are no lung cavities coughing up millions of bacilli.
Which makes it incredibly difficult to diagnose and highly lethal. TB accounts for roughly a quarter of all HIV-related deaths globally. In parts of southern Africa, the TB epidemic is almost entirely driven by the HIV syndemic.
But while HIV is the most potent individual risk factor, public health requires us to look at the aggregate population level. To do that, epidemiologists use a metric called the population attributable fraction, or PAF.
I love this metric. The PAF asks a critical hypothetical question. If we possessed a magic wand and could completely eliminate one specific risk factor from a population, by what absolute percentage would the total incidence of the disease fall?
It's the structural engineering audit for our collapsing building. If the goal is to stop the building from falling, to stop the TB epidemic, where do we deploy our limited resources?
Exactly.
Do we spend our entire budget reinforcing the windows, which might represent highly targeted medical treatments? Or do we fix the crumbling foundation, which represents systemic poverty, undernutrition, and environmental hazards?
The PAF gives you the mathematical justification for your intervention. In a region like southern Africa, the PAF for HIV is massive, over 50%. If you eliminate HIV there, TB incidence drops by half.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the global picture is surprisingly different. Globally, HIV is associated with only about 11% of all TB incidents.
Wait, really? Only 11% globally?
Yeah. What the modeling shows is that globally, the total elimination of undernutrition, or the elimination of tobacco smoking, or the elimination of indoor air pollution from biomass cooking fuels
Let me guess.
would each independently lead to a greater absolute reduction in global TB incidence than the complete global elimination of HIV.
That is a staggering realization for anyone trained in a purely biomedical model. I mean, we spend billions hunting viruses and designing complex molecules, but the math says feeding people and giving them clean stoves would prevent more tuberculosis.
It's humbling, isn't it?
Very. Let's dig into the mechanisms of those other drivers. Take smoking. The modeling suggests that tobacco smoking could be responsible for 40 million excess TB deaths by 2050. How does smoke actually do that?
Smoking acts on multiple fronts. First, it damages the mucociliary escalator. Those are the tiny hairs in your airway that constantly sweep debris and pathogens up and out of your lungs. It also directly impairs the phagocytic ability of your alveolar macrophages. A smoke-damaged macrophage is sluggish. It cannot efficiently engulf and destroy the Mycobacterium.
So it's a double hit to the localized immune defenses.
Exactly. Therefore, smoking increases the risk of initial infection upon exposure, it increases the risk of a latent infection progressing to active disease, and it increases the risk of death during treatment.
And what about diabetes? We know that in the pre-insulin era, TB was the cause of death for roughly 50% of all diabetic patients. But even today, with modern endocrinology, diabetes triples the risk of incident TB.
It does. It impairs cellular immunity, it alters the metabolism of TB drugs, and it significantly prolongs the time it takes for a patient to convert to a negative sputum culture.
Meaning they remain infectious longer.
Exactly.
We also have to examine highly concentrated occupational hazards, which serve as massive amplifiers of transmission. The quintessential example in the textbook is the intersection of silicosis and congregate settings, most notably in the South African gold mining industry.
Oh, this is a perfect example of occupational structural failure.
Walk us through the physiology of that environment. Why is a gold mine the perfect incubator?
It starts with silica dust. When miners drill into the quartz rock, they inhale crystalline silica dust. These microscopic, jagged particles are engulfed by the alveolar macrophages.
Which is their job.
Right. But silica is highly toxic to the macrophage. It causes the immune cell to rupture and die, releasing the silica back into the lung to be engulfed by another macrophage in this continuous cycle of localized cell death and scarring.
And that's silicosis.
Yes. If you systematically destroy the very immune cells required to fight TB, The host is profoundly vulnerable.
So you have a workforce with structurally compromised lungs. Then you house those workers in crowded, poorly ventilated single-sex dormitories. Then you introduce a high prevalence of HIV into that population.
It creates an epidemiological nightmare. You combine local macrophage destruction, systemic CD4 cell depletion from HIV, and a hypercrowded indoor environment. The incidence rates of TB in these mining communities routinely exceed 1,000 cases per 100,000 people per year.
It is one of the highest concentrated rates of disease on the entire planet. And this environment perfectly highlights the limits of a purely biomedical intervention. The textbook discusses the Tibella TB study, which was this enormous, ambitious trial involving over 80,000 South African gold miners.
Yeah, a massive undertaking.
The intervention was mass screening combined with giving everyone isoniazid preventive therapy, or IPT, to treat any latent infections. The results were incredibly revealing, weren't they?
Very revealing. While the miners were actively taking the daily pill, they were protected. But at the community level, once the intervention ended, the overall TB incidence didn't meaningfully drop.
Because the intervention didn't change the built environment. It treated the bacteria currently inside the host. But it didn't change the fact that the host went right back down into the silica-filled, poorly ventilated shaft the very next day.
Exactly. The extreme ongoing rate of exposure meant that as soon as the prophylactic drug was out of their system, they were rapidly reinfected. It proves that you simply cannot medicate your way out of a structural crisis.
Which is the perfect bridge to understanding how our attempts to control this disease have evolved and, tragically, how they have sometimes completely backfired. Let's look at the evolution of TB control and the terrifying paradox of drug resistance.
Right. If we look historically, before the discovery of antibiotics, the primary public health response was the sanatorium movement.
Ah, yes, the fresh air cures.
Yeah. It involved isolating patients, usually the wealthy, in alpine or rural facilities, relying on fresh air, strict bed rest, and improved nutrition to help the immune system naturally wall off the infection. It was essentially enforcing the social determinants of health on an individual level.
Then, in 1943, Albert Schatz and Selman Waksman discovered streptomycin. The modern biomedical era began. For decades, the global strategy was largely passive case detection clinics, basically just waited for sick, coughing people to show up, diagnosed them, and gave them drugs.
But in the 1990s, the World Health Organization recognized this wasn't enough and launched DOTS, Directly Observed Therapy, Short Course.
And DOTS was a monumental, necessary shift in global public health governance, right? It wasn't just about the drugs, it was a management strategy.
Absolutely. It required sustained political commitment, a secure and uninterrupted drug supply chain, standardized bacteriological case detection, and crucially, supervised treatment.
Meaning a healthcare worker physically watches the patient swallow every single dose of medication.
Yes, every single one.
And the biomedical hammer at the center of DOTS is the first-line treatment regimen, commonly memorized by clinicians as the RIPE cocktail: rifampin, isoniazid, pyricinide, and ethambutol. But it's vital to understand why we use 4 different drugs, because they aren't just redundant, they do very different jobs.
The pharmacology here is fascinating. Isoniazid is your rapid early bactericidal agent. It aggressively kills the bacilli that are actively dividing and multiplying in the oxygen-rich cavities of the lung.
Okay, so that knocks down the bulk of the bacteria. What about pyrazinamide?
Pyrazinamide is entirely different. It is uniquely effective in the highly acidic, low-oxygen environment inside the macrophage phagolysosome. It hunts down the semi-dormant bacilli hiding inside the immune cells.
So it goes where the isoniazid can't.
Exactly. Then rifampin is your heavy-duty sterilizing agent. It targets persistent bacilli across all environments, ensuring the patient doesn't relapse months later.
And the 4th one, ethambutol.
Ethambutol acts primarily as a bodyguard. It prevents the bacteria from developing resistance to the other 3 drugs during the intense early phase of treatment.
It is a brilliantly coordinated pharmacological assault. But here's the catch. It takes at least 6 months of grueling, toxic therapy to ensure every last slow-growing bacillus is dead.
And 6 months is an eternity in human behavior.
It really is. Patients often start feeling dramatically better after just a few weeks. The fever breaks, the cough subsides, they gain weight. The temptation to stop taking a cocktail of heavy medications that cause nausea, liver stress, and joint pain is immense.
Understandably so.
And this behavioral reality collides with the biology of the bacteria to create the most terrifying part of this deep dive, the resistance crisis. MDR and XDR TB, multi-drug resistant and extensively drug-resistant TB.
To truly grasp the horror of MDR-TB, we have to explain the mechanism of resistance, and it comes down to sheer mathematical probability.
Okay, let's hear the math.
Resistance in Mycobacterium tuberculosis does not usually occur through the sharing of plasmids like it does in E. coli or staph. It arises from spontaneous, naturally occurring genetic mutations in the bacterial chromosome.
So it's just random chance.
Yes. In a patient with extensive cavitary TB, their lungs might contain billions of bacilli. Just by random genetic error during replication, a very small number of those bacilli will naturally harbor a mutation that alters the target site of a drug, making them resistant to, say, isoniazid.
And what are the odds of that?
The odds of this spontaneous mutation are roughly 1 in a billion 10 to the -9.
Okay, so in a billion bacteria, you have one mutant that just naturally ignores isoniazid.
Right, and the odds of a separate random mutation conferring resistance to rifampin might be 1 in 10 million or 10 to the -8.
Okay.
But what is the probability of a single bacterium spontaneously mutating to become resistant to both drugs simultaneously? It is the product of those probabilities. 10 to the -9 multiplied by 10 to the -8.
So 10 to the -17.
Yes. That number is astronomically rare. It simply does not happen naturally in the bacillary load of a single patient. This immutable mathematical law is the entire rationale behind combination therapy. If you hit the population with 4 drugs simultaneously, no single bacterium possesses the genetic lottery ticket to survive all 4. The infection is eradicated.
But what happens when human error alters the math? What happens if the national supply chain breaks down and the clinic runs out of rifampin?
Or the patient feels better, stops taking 3 of the pills because they cause nausea, but keeps taking the isoniazid because it's well tolerated.
Right. Or a well-meaning but untrained doctor prescribes the wrong dosage entirely.
That phenomenon is called sequential monotherapy, and it is a biological disaster. If a patient only takes one drug, let's say isoniazid, that drug acts as an evolutionary sieve.
It rapidly kills the 999 million susceptible bacteria.
But it leaves alive that 1 billion naturally mutated resistant bacterium. Suddenly, that single survivor has no competition for resources. It multiplies rapidly, and soon the patient's entire bacillary population is resistant to isoniazid.
Wow.
If a doctor then realizes the patient isn't getting better and adds just one new drug to the failing regimen, the cycle repeats. The new drug kills the susceptible ones, selects for the double mutant, and now you have multi-drug resistant TB.
So we are not just failing to cure the patient, we are actively, artificially forcing the evolution of a superbug.
That is exactly what we are doing. It's the tragic paradox of TB control. Historically, this dynamic was categorized as acquired resistance. A specific patient acquired a resistant strain because their specific treatment regimen was mismanaged. It was an individual clinical failure.
But today, the epidemiology has shifted in a terrifying way, hasn't it?
It has. We are now dealing with massive rates of primary resistance. This means these laboratory-engineered superbugs have escaped the host and are now transmitting freely in the air.
The textbook highlights China as a prime example of this. They have over 100,000 incident cases of MDR-TB every single year, and the majority of those patients have never been treated for TB before.
No prior treatment history at all.
They didn't fail a treatment regimen. They simply inhaled a droplet nucleus on a crowded bus that was already genetically immune to our 2 best drugs, isoniazid and rifampin.
And treating an MDR-TB patient is a monumental undertaking. It requires up to 2 years of therapy. It traditionally required painful daily injections for the first 8 months.
And the side effects.
The second-line drugs are highly toxic. They can cause permanent deafness, severe psychiatric side effects, and renal failure. The treatment costs up to 10 times as much as standard therapy, and despite all of that, the global cure rate for MDR-TB hovers around 50 to 70%.
And if that wasn't gum enough, we have the evolution of XDR-TB, extensively drug-resistant PAB. This is MDR-TB that is also resistant to fluoroquinolones and the injectable agents. The textbook discusses a watershed moment in global health that illustrated the raw lethality of this strain, the 2006 nosocomial outbreak in Tugello in the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa.
Nosocomial, meaning it was an outbreak driven by transmission within a healthcare facility. This event was a perfect storm. You had a rural hospital crowded with patients suffering from advanced, undiagnosed HIV, meaning their CD4 counts were negligible. Into those crowded, poorly ventilated wards, XDR-TB was introduced.
The clinical reality of that outbreak is harrowing. Because these patients had virtually no immune system to slow the bacteria down, and the bacteria were immune to virtually all available drugs, the disease simply annihilated them. The case fatality rate in that initial cohort was an astonishing 98%.
It was devastating. But it was the speed of the killing that shocked the world. The median survival time from the point of sputum collection to the death of the patient was 16 days.
16 days. In many cases, the patients were dying of pulmonary destruction before the laboratory could even finish growing the culture to confirm it was XDR-TB. The diagnostic turnaround time was longer than the patient's remaining lifespan.
It is an absolute nightmare scenario that exposes the fragility of our systems.
Which forces us to look at systems thinking and the public health response. How do we engineer a system that doesn't just react to these superbugs, but actively hunts them down and stops their creation? It begins with how we find the cases in the first place, right?
Yes. We discussed DOTS and its reliance on passive case finding, waiting for the sick patient to realize they are sick, overcome the socioeconomic barriers to travel, and present themselves at a clinic.
Which has a fundamental flaw regarding timing.
Exactly. Prevalence surveys clearly demonstrate that the majority of airborne transmission in a community occurs before the index patient ever seeks medical care. The individual might cough for months before they feel sick enough to lose a day's wages to visit a doctor. If you wait for them to come to you, you are always operating months behind the transmission curve.
So, to bend that curve downward, passive finding must be augmented by active case finding. We have to go out into the community, screen populations, and find the disease in its early stages. But the textbook points out a massive economic and logistical hurdle here. Even in high-burden countries, active prevalent TB is still relatively rare at a general population level.
It is a needle in a very large haystack. If you decide to roll out mobile X-ray trucks and screen an entire city's population indiscriminately, the cost per case detected becomes astronomical, sometimes exceeding $10,000 per confirmed case.
Yeah, that's not sustainable.
Not at all. The ZAMSTAR trial, a massive study conducted in Zambia and South Africa, proved this. They implemented untargeted, community-wide active screening and found that it did not significantly reduce the overall incidence of TB. It is simply too resource-intensive to maintain its scale. You cannot boil the ocean.
So, if broad community screening is economically unviable, the strategic solution is targeted active case finding. You don't screen the whole city. You deploy your resources exclusively to the highest risk nodes. You set up screening protocols in diabetic clinics. You screen every patient entering an HIV ward. You screen populations in prisons, and you monitor those mining communities.
You look where the kindling is driest.
Precisely. And when you are operating in those high-risk nodes, particularly regarding the co-epidemic of TB and HIV, the WHO recommends a highly structured approach known as the 3 I's: intensified case finding, isoniazid preventive therapy, IPT, and infection control.
Let's unpack the clinical reasoning behind integrating HIV and TB care, because for a long time they operated in complete silos.
Right.
If a patient is co-infected, the timing of when you start their antiretroviral therapy, or ART, is a literal life or death decision. The data is clear. Starting RT early, within the first few weeks of TB diagnosis, rather than waiting months for the TB treatment to finish, reduces mortality by up to 40% in severely immunocompromised patients.
It is highly effective, but it requires masterful clinical navigation, doesn't it? You are walking a physiological tightrope. First, you have severe drug interactions. Rifampin, the cornerstone sterilizing TB drug, is a potent inducer of cytochrome P4 hefty enzymes in the liver.
Yeah, it rapidly accelerates the metabolism of certain CODES inhibitors used for HIV, basically rendering the HIV drugs ineffective. Clinicians have to carefully adjust doses or switch drug classes entirely.
And then there's the phenomenon of iris immune reconstitution inflammatory syndrome. This is fascinating pathophysiology.
It really is. Imagine a patient with advanced HIV and widespread disseminated TB. Because their CD4 count is so low, their immune system is essentially ignoring the massive bacterial burden. There's very little inflammation because there's no immune response.
The military is asleep.
Exactly.
Wow.
But when you start them on highly active antiretroviral therapy, their immune system rapidly wakes up. The newly generated immune cells suddenly recognize that the body is absolutely saturated with TB bacilli, and they launch a massive, uncoordinated hyperinflammatory attack.
The immune system essentially panics. The patient's lymph nodes massively swell, their fever spikes, their lungs fill with fluid. It looks exactly like the TB is getting radically worse, but paradoxically, it's actually the immune system working again.
Right. But it can be fatal if the inflammation compromises the airway or the brain, requiring clinicians to sometimes step in with high-dose corticosteroids to suppress the very immune system they just woke up.
It requires immense clinical skill. But the third I of the WHO framework, infection control, is arguably the most important and the most neglected aspect of the systemic response. This goes back to our structural engineering metaphor. We have to change the air.
Yes, the hierarchy of infection control in any clinical or congregate setting operates on 3 tiers: administrative, environmental, and respiratory.
Walk us through how these work in practice.
Administrative control is the first and most crucial line of defense. It relies on rapid triage and workflow management. It means identifying the coughing patient the moment they walk into the crowded waiting room, fast-tracking their diagnosis, and physically isolating them from the vulnerable HIV patient sitting nearby. It is purely logistical.
Then, environmental control is the structural engineering. It focuses on ventilation and the dilution of infectious droplet nuclei. How many air exchanges per hour are happening in that ward? Are you using negative pressure rooms so air flows in from the corridor but doesn't flow out? Are you using ultraviolet germicidal irradiation in the upper air ducts to destroy the DNA of the airborne bacilli?
And finally, respiratory control, which is the last line of defense. Personal protective equipment, ensuring healthcare workers are wearing properly fitted N95 particulate respirators, not just standard surgical masks, which do literally nothing to stop a microscopic droplet nucleus.
The textbook provides a stunning real-world example of this hierarchy in action. During the late 1980s, there was an outbreak of MDR-TB in a Florida hospital, spreading rapidly among HIV patients. They were seeing an average of 3 new nosocomial MDR cases every single month. It was an institutional crisis.
What do they do?
They didn't invent a new drug. They fundamentally altered their infection control systems. They implemented rigorous administrative triage. They rebuilt the ventilation system to ensure high-velocity air exchanges and installed negative pressure isolation rooms. They mandated N95 masks, and the result, they stopped the outbreak cold. The transmission rate dropped to 0.
That's incredible.
Sometimes the most highly effective, life-saving clinical intervention isn't a complex pharmacological cocktail. It's simply ensuring the windows are open and the exhaust fans are running.
It is the ultimate dilution of the hazard, which permanently lowers the risk. But as we look toward the future, we have to acknowledge a sobering reality. Applying our existing tools, perfectly maximizing DOTS, scaling up infection control, treating HIV is essential, but mathematical models indicate it is not sufficient to actually eliminate the disease globally.
So containment isn't enough.
No. If we want to move from containment to elimination, we need fundamentally new tools.
Let's examine the horizon of those new tools, starting with diagnostics. We noted earlier that relying on sputum smear microscopy is relying on a 130-year-old technology. It misses the children, it misses the extrapulmonary HIV patients, and crucially, it tells you nothing about drug resistance. You can look at a bacillus under a microscope, but you can't tell if it's MDR-TB just by looking at it. But we have recently made massive molecular leaps.
The defining game changer in modern TB diagnostics has been the expert MTBRF assay. This is a fully automated cartridge-based nucleic acid amplification test, essentially a rapid PCR machine.
How does it work?
You put the raw sputum sample into a cartridge, slide it into the machine, and it extracts the DNA, amplifies it, and looks for specific genetic sequences. Within 90 minutes, it tells you not only if the patient has Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but by looking for mutations in the RPPO-B gene, it tells you simultaneously if that specific strain is resistant to rifampin.
The speed of that is revolutionary. Remember the Tuberculosis outbreak where patients died in 16 days while waiting for traditional culture results? With Expert, you know within 2 hours if you were dealing with an MDR strain, allowing you to bypass the standard ineffective drugs and start the patient immediately on the correct second-line regimen. It boasts over 99% sensitivity for smear-positive disease.
It's a phenomenal tool, but as public health practitioners, we must recognize its systemic limitations.
Right, the infrastructure again.
Yeah, exactly. Expert machines are expensive. They require a continuously climate-controlled room because the reagents degrade in high heat. They require a highly stable electrical grid, and they require annual mechanical calibration. You cannot simply drop a sensitive molecular machine into a remote, under-resourced clinic with intermittent power and expect it to function. It solves the biological diagnostic problem, but it demands a robust infrastructure.
And what about diagnosing those advanced HIV patients who cannot produce a sputum sample at all? If the disease is disseminated in their organs, looking at their spit, even with a PCR machine, won't help.
That specific clinical challenge has been met by a fascinating biomarker diagnostic, the LAM assay. LAM stands for lipoarabinomannan. It is a core lipid component of the mycobacterial cell wall. When a patient has severe disseminated TB, these cell wall components break down, circulate in the bloodstream, and are ultimately filtered by the kidneys and excreted in the urine.
Which means we now have a point-of-care lateral flow urine test. It looks and functions almost exactly like a home pregnancy test. It requires no electricity, no laboratory, and costs about $3. You put a few drops of urine on the strip, and 30 minutes later, a band appears if LAM is present.
It's a really elegant solution. Now, its clinical application is highly specific. Its sensitivity is quite low in immunocompetent individuals with localized lung disease.
That for the vulnerable ones.
In patients with severe immune compromise, specifically those with a CD4 count under 50, where traditional diagnostics fail most spectacularly, the LAM assay is highly effective at detecting disseminated disease. It is a perfectly targeted tool for an incredibly vulnerable population, allowing clinicians to initiate life-saving therapy immediately at the bedside.
We should also briefly mention interferon gamma release assays, or IGRAs. These are blood tests used primarily in higher resource settings. They measure the cellular immune response to specific TB antigens. They are significantly more specific than the old tuberculin skin test because they don't produce false positives in people who have had the BCG vaccine. However, the textbook explicitly warns that while they are great at proving you have a latent infection, they have very poor predictive value in determining who will actually progress to active disease in high-burden settings. You can't use an IGRA to predict the future.
Right. Diagnostic advancements are critical, but identifying a highly resistant strain is only useful if we have the drugs to treat it. For nearly 50 years, the global pipeline for new TB drugs was entirely stagnant. We were fighting a rapidly evolving 21st century superbug with mid-20th century pharmacology.
But that pipeline has finally started to flow again. We are seeing the introduction of class 6 drugs agents with entirely novel mechanisms of action that the bacteria have never encountered before. The most prominent example is bedaquiline. How does this drug actually kill the bacillus?
Bedaquiline is revolutionary because it targets the bacterial ATP synthase enzyme. ATP is the fundamental energy currency of the cell. Bedaquiline essentially binds to the motor of this enzyme, jamming it and completely cutting off the bacterium's energy supply.
It starves the cell of energy.
Exactly. Because its mechanism is entirely unique, it is highly effective against strains that have developed resistance to all our traditional drugs. We also have delaminid, which disrupts the synthesis of mycolic acid, a crucial component of the thick mycobacterial cell wall. These novel classes are not just additions to the arsenal, they are the absolute last line of defense against XDR-TB.
And finally, we have to talk about prevention. We need a better fireproof coating for the environment. We have the BCG vaccine developed by Calmette and Guerin a century ago. It is the most widely administered vaccine in human history. Most of the world receives it shortly after birth.
Yeah, but BCG is highly effective at only its primary task, preventing the severe, lethal, disseminated forms of TB in infants, the miliary TB and TB meningitis we discussed earlier. It primes the infant immune system just enough to prevent the bacteria from flooding the bloodstream.
But it has a fatal epidemiological flaw.
It does. It provides virtually zero protection against the development of adult pulmonary TB. And adult pulmonary TB is the engine that drives global transmission. BCG protects the individual infant, but it does absolutely nothing to stop the epidemic at a population level.
So the race for a new vaccine is critical. The structural thinking divides this research into two distinct goals: pre-exposure and post-exposure vaccines. A pre-exposure vaccine would be administered to uninfected infants, ideally providing durable, lifelong immunity against infection, or at least providing a safer alternative to BCG for infants born with HIV who can sometimes develop systemic illness from the live BCG strain.
But the holy grail of TB research is the post-exposure vaccine. This would be a therapeutic vaccine given to adults who already harbor a latent infection.
So treating the people who already have the coal fire smoldering inside them.
Exactly. The goal wouldn't be to prevent initial exposure, but to artificially boost the host's T-cell response, essentially sending reinforcements to the granuloma to permanently eradicate the dormant bacilli. It would be designed to put out the smoldering coal fire safely beneath the surface before it ever has a chance to erupt into active disease.
And a post-exposure vaccine is mathematically necessary if we ever hope to achieve actual elimination. In global public health, elimination is rigorously defined as reaching an incidence of less than 1 case per million population. When epidemiologists run the mathematical models, looking toward the WHO's 2050 targets, the results are unambiguous. Perfecting the fundamentals, scaling up DOTS, strengthening laboratory networks, and improving housing is necessary, but insufficient.
It is insufficient because of the bathtub we described at the beginning. You can turn off the faucet of new transmission by curing all the active cases, but you still have a massive global reservoir of latent infection, up to a quarter of the human population.
A quarter of humanity.
Yeah, as long as that reservoir exists, the disease will constantly reactivate and spark new outbreaks. To reach true elimination, we must deploy a novel post-exposure vaccine or ultra-short-course prophylactic drugs to systematically clear that unseen reservoir.
Okay, as we bring this conceptual deep dive to a close, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on as you carry these frameworks into your clinical practice or public health planning. Throughout our exploration of Chapter 8.1 Teen, we've seen how Mycobacterium tuberculosis is a masterful exploiter of structural vulnerability. It is a biological entity, yes, but its survival depends entirely on human conditions. Crowded prisons, silica-choked mines, undernourished communities, and fragile health systems.
That's the real takeaway here.
So when we look at the billions of dollars spent annually searching for the next novel molecule or the next automated PCR machine, we have to ask a difficult structural question. Are we obsessively focused on building a more technologically advanced fire extinguisher while simultaneously continuing to force our most vulnerable populations to live inside highly flammable, densely packed, poorly ventilated kindling? Can we ever truly medicate our way out of an epidemic that is so fundamentally rooted in the built environment and the social determinants of health? It is the core tension between biomedical innovation and structural equity.
That is the ultimate challenge for the next generation of clinicians and epidemiologists. The biomedical tools are essential for the patient in front of you, but bending the global curve requires the political will to change the air they breathe when they leave your clinic.
Now, to consolidate the frameworks we've built today, let's run through our rapid recall prompts. If you are preparing for exams or just want to solidify your clinical reasoning, treat these as single best answer style questions. I will read the scenario, I'll pause for a moment to let you formulate the answer, and then the expert will provide the resolution and the exact framework reference from the textbook. Ready? Let's dive in.
Sounds good.
Prompt 1. Which immunological state is now understood to represent a dynamic, active host pathogen conflict, often featuring metabolically active bacilli rather than a state of complete bacterial dormancy, thereby creating a massive, volatile global reservoir for the disease? Take a second to think.
The answer is latent TB infection. You can review the updated paradigm of this spectrum in the Natural History of Tuberculosis section of the chapter.
Prompt 2. In the context of the population attributable fraction, or PAF, the complete global elimination of which specific social determinant would yield a greater absolute numerical reduction in global TB incidence than the complete elimination of HIV. Think about the global modeling we discussed.
The correct answers are undernutrition, tobacco smoking, or indoor air pollution. The mathematical modeling for this is detailed in the risk factors section under the discussion of PAF.
Prompt 3. From an epidemiological surveillance perspective, what is the primary public health utility of diagnosing a case of active tuberculosis in an infant or young child? Take a moment.
The young child acts as a sentinel. Because they rarely generate enough force to aerosolize the bacteria, their infection indicates recent active transmission from an infectious adult within their immediate household contact network. Review the pediatric TB section for this dynamic.
Prompt 4. By what specific evolutionary mechanism does a poorly managed drug supply chain leading to sequential monotherapy, artificially engineered multi-drug-resistant TB, or MDR-TB?
Sequential monotherapy acts as an evolutionary sieve, selectively killing susceptible bacteria while allowing rare, naturally occurring spontaneous genetic mutants to survive, multiply, and become the dominant strain. This mathematical reality is explained in the drug-resistant TB section.
Prompt 5. You are treating an advanced HIV patient with the CD4 count of 12. They are incapable of producing a sputum sample, which rapid point-of-care lateral flow diagnostic test takes advantage of a specific mycobacterial cell wall lipid excreted by the kidneys. Take a second.
That would be the LAM assay, or lipoarabinomannan assay. Its specific utility and severe immunosuppression is detailed in the new diagnostic tests section.
Prompt 6. Within the hierarchy of infection control for congregate settings, which specific tier relies on interventions like negative pressure isolation rooms and high-velocity air exchanges to dilute the concentration of infectious droplet nuclei?
Environmental control. You can review the 3 tiers: administrative, environmental, and respiratory in the TB infection control section.
Prompt 7. The Tabela TB study provided mass isoniazid preventive therapy to South African gold miners. Why did this massive biomedical intervention fail to produce a sustained drop in community-level TB incidence once the trial concluded?
Because the intervention did not alter the extreme occupational hazard of the built environment. Once the prophylaxis stopped, the intense ongoing rate of exposure to silica dust and active cases in the mines led to rapid, widespread reinfection. This structural limitation is analyzed in the management of HIV-associated TB section.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We strongly encourage you to actively review Chapter 8.14 in the Oxford textbook to solidify these mechanisms and continue refining your structural approach to global health. Until next time, here are the details of this episode.
Tuberculosis. Byline. An ancient airborne disease at the intersection of poverty, resistance, and global control efforts. Episode description. Tuberculosis, TB, remains one of the leading infectious causes of death worldwide, despite being preventable and treatable. Caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, it spreads primarily through airborne transmission and disproportionately affects low- and middle-income countries. This episode examines global epidemiology and high-burden regions. This episode examines latent versus active tuberculosis. This episode examines risk factors: HIV co-infection, malnutrition, overcrowding. This episode examines drug-sensitive and multi-drug-resistant TB, MDR-TB. This episode examines diagnostic strategies and laboratory capacity. This episode examines directly observed therapy and treatment adherence. This episode examines social determinants and housing conditions. This episode examines TB in prisons and marginalized populations. This episode examines global NTB strategies and elimination goals. This episode examines tuberculosis highlights the enduring link between infectious disease and social inequality. Crowded housing, poor ventilation, undernutrition, and limited access to care sustain transmission cycles. While modern diagnostics and treatment regimens have improved outcomes, drug resistance poses a significant threat. This episode examines. The episode explores both biomedical and structural responses, recognizing that TB control requires strengthened health systems, poverty reduction, and sustained global coordination. This episode examines. Tuberculosis persists not because it cannot be treated, but because its determinants extend beyond medicine. This episode examines. Key takeaways. This episode examines. Tuberculosis remains a leading cause of infectious mortality. This episode examines. Latent infection creates a large reservoir of potential disease. This episode examines. HIV co-infection significantly increases risk. This episode examines. Drug-resistant TB complicates treatment efforts. This episode examines. Early detection and treatment adherence are critical. This episode examines. The social determinants drive transmission patterns. This episode examines. Global elimination requires coordinated international effort.